The Sahara Desert reaches temperatures that would liquefy human flesh if you survived long enough to experience it. A single night out there means facing temperatures that plummet from 120 degrees to below freezing in just a few hours. Your water disappears into the air. Your skin cracks. Your eyes burn. Yet 5,000 years ago, ancient Egyptians didn't just survive these nights. They thrived in them. They built an empire in this hostile wasteland. They crossed it. They mapped it. They somehow knew the secrets to staying alive when staying alive seemed impossible. The question isn't how they managed it. The question is, what did they know that we forgot? The Sahara covers 3.6 million square miles. It's one of the deadliest environments on Earth. Even today, with GPS, satellites, and emergency supplies, people die crossing it. But for the ancient Egyptians, the desert wasn't a boundary they feared. It was a landscape they understood. Traders traveled across it for months, soldiers marched through it, pharaohs sent expeditions into its depths, and most of them came back alive. Modern explorers following in their footsteps have discovered something puzzling. The ancient Egyptians possessed survival knowledge so sophisticated that some of their techniques wouldn't be rediscovered by modern science until centuries later. They knew how to find water in places where no water seemed to exist. They understood the desert's hidden rhythms, the precise times when the heat peaked and when it dropped. They organized their movements around patterns that seemed almost supernatural. But it wasn't magic. It was something more interesting. It was hard-won knowledge, discovered through trial, error, and centuries of observation. And what's remarkable is how much of it has been recorded, not in books, but in the artifacts, architecture, and practices that survived alongside them. To understand how the ancient Egyptians survived the desert, you need to understand something crucial. They didn't just live near the desert. They lived in it. The Nile Valley was their lifeline, yes. But the desert surrounded them on all sides. The western desert to the west, the eastern desert to the east. They couldn't ignore it, and they couldn't conquer it through force alone. Instead, they studied it. By around 2500 BCE, Egypt wasn't just a river civilization, it was becoming a desert civilization. Traders moved minerals and goods across the Sahara. Pharaohs sent military expeditions deep into the sand to establish trade routes and locate resources like gold, emeralds, and limestone. These journeys weren't quick trips. Some lasted weeks, some lasted months. And the ancient Egyptians had to figure out from scratch how to keep people alive in one of the world's most hostile environments. They had no thermometers, no modern hydration science, no emergency protocols. They only had observation, intuition, and the willingness to learn from failure, often paying in lives. But gradually, they cracked the code. The first problem: water. The most obvious threat in the desert is dehydration. A human can survive weeks without food. Without water? 3 days. Maybe 4 in the cold. But here's what the ancient Egyptians understood. Water was never truly gone. It was just hidden. In the desert, finding water means finding patterns. The Egyptians mapped the locations of underground aquifers, massive reservoirs of water trapped beneath the sand for millennia. They couldn't see them, but they knew where to dig. How? Through observation. Certain plants only grow where groundwater is close to the surface. Certain rock formations indicate water-bearing strata below. Birds gather at specific times, which means they're heading to water. Even animal tracks can lead you to hidden oases. The ancient Egyptians created something revolutionary: desert maps. Not detailed topographical maps like we think of them today, but functional guides that recorded the locations of wells, water sources, and routes between them. Expeditions carried these maps passed down through generations, each journey adding new information. Archaeological evidence shows that major Egyptian expeditions followed remarkably consistent routes across the desert. This wasn't coincidence. This was planning. Every major expedition stopped at the same wells, in the same sequence, separated by days of walking, a pattern that made biological sense. The distance between wells was calculated to match human endurance: travel at dawn and dusk to avoid the worst heat, cover perhaps 20 miles a day, reach water by nightfall. It was a system. The second challenge: temperature. But water wasn't the only threat. The temperature swings were equally deadly. During the day, direct sunlight on sand can exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, exposed skin blisters. Breath becomes painful, your body sweats itself dry. But nighttime brings a shock. Temperatures plummet to 40 or even 30 degrees. The massive heat loss causes hypothermia. The ancient Egyptians solved this through practical wisdom and architectural thinking. First, they understood timing. They didn't try to cross the desert at midday. Instead, expeditions moved during the cooler hours pre-dawn and evening and rested during the most dangerous heat. Not because they had thermometers, but because they paid attention to their own bodies and the environment. This wasn't intuitive for everyone, but it was taught. Experienced guides trained new travelers on these rhythms. The knowledge was preserved through practice and mentorship. Second, they used clothing strategically. Unlike modern assumptions about desert dress, the Egyptians didn't wear minimal clothing. They wore long, light-colored linens that covered most of their body. This protected skin from direct sun exposure and reduced water loss through the skin. The loose fit allowed air circulation that helped with cooling. Modern studies have confirmed this. Covered skin in the desert loses less moisture than exposed skin. They also wrapped their heads, a practice that modern desert travelers still follow. The human head radiates an enormous amount of heat. Covering it reduces this loss and protects the face and eyes from the most intense sunlight. Third, they understood the strategic importance of shelter during the night. A night in the desert can feel like the temperature is dropping forever. The ground radiates all its stored heat into space. Wind picks up. Moisture in the air becomes ice cold. Hypothermia is real and deadly. But the ancient Egyptians discovered something that modern physics would later explain. Sand is a natural insulator. If you dig a shallow depression in the sand and lie in it, surrounded by sand on three sides, the sand moderates the temperature extremes. You're not exposed to the wind. The sand around you retains some warmth from the day. Archaeological sites in the eastern desert show evidence of these shallow sleeping pits, carefully positioned to face away from prevailing winds and oriented to catch warmth from residual ground heat. The third problem: mental endurance. But beyond water and temperature lay something equally dangerous: the mind. Spend a day crossing an endless sea of sand where the horizon looks identical in every direction, and your sense of direction dissolves. Spend a night alone in complete darkness, where sound carries strangely and the mind fills the void with fears, and despair becomes as real a threat as dehydration. The ancient Egyptians recognized this. They traveled in groups, never alone. An expedition typically included several people, sometimes dozens depending on the route and purpose. There was practical wisdom here. If one person faltered, others could help. If someone drank too much water early, the group could enforce rationing. If someone panicked, experienced leaders could calm them. But there was also psychological wisdom. Humans perform better under stress when they're not alone. The presence of other people, familiar faces, voices, these are survival tools as important as water bottles or maps. Expeditions followed strict hierarchies. The leader had been across the route before. Younger members followed experienced ones. They sang together. They shared meals. They maintained routines. These weren't luxuries. They were survival strategies, encoded in cultural practice. The unexpected discovery. Now here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. The ancient Egyptians didn't just survive the desert. Some records suggest certain groups became so adapted to desert travel that they may have deliberately sought out extreme conditions for spiritual or ritual purposes. Evidence from temple inscriptions and tomb paintings shows that some journeys to remote desert locations weren't purely practical. They seemed to have ceremonial significance. Priests traveled to distant oases for religious reasons. Military leaders marched deep into the desert as demonstrations of power and divine favor. This wasn't reckless. These expeditions were heavily planned, well-provisioned, and led by experienced guides. But they suggest something remarkable. The ancient Egyptians had achieved a level of desert mastery so complete that they could afford to push the boundaries, to test their knowledge, to go deeper than purely necessary. This is the signature of a civilization that didn't just survive a harsh environment. It had learned to read it, understand it, and navigate it with confidence. How knowledge spread. The final piece of this puzzle is understanding how this knowledge survived and spread. The ancient Egyptians didn't invent written survival manuals, but they preserved knowledge through oral tradition. Experienced guides trained apprentices through story and demonstration. Institutional memory. Temples and administrative centers kept records of successful routes and techniques. Practical inheritance, tools, maps, and equipment were passed down and refined. Cultural celebration, successful expeditions were commemorated, reinforcing their lessons. This is why certain routes, wells, and techniques persisted unchanged for thousands of years. Knowledge wasn't stored in books. It was stored in practice, in people, and in institutions. Part 5. The Twist. But here's what makes this story stranger than it first appears. We tend to think of survival knowledge as something hardwired into indigenous peoples through generations of natural selection. We imagine that desert-dwelling peoples are somehow biologically adapted to extreme heat and dehydration. They're not. The ancient Egyptians were human beings with human bodies. They could die from dehydration just as easily as you or me. They couldn't extract water from thin air or regulate their body temperature through supernatural means. Yet they survived, thrived, and built an empire. The difference wasn't biological, it was intellectual. They observed patterns, they asked questions, they tested solutions, they passed down knowledge, they created systems. And what's remarkable is that many of their techniques have been validated by modern science. The optimal travel schedule they followed, moving at dawn and dusk, resting during peak heat, aligns perfectly with human physiology and thermoregulation. Their choice of clothing matches modern understanding of how fabric interacts with solar radiation and evaporative cooling. They didn't know the physics, but they knew the practice. This reveals something profound about human potential. Given enough time and need, humans can solve seemingly impossible problems through observation and intelligence alone. The ancient Egyptians didn't have modern science, but they had something equally powerful. They paid attention. So, how did the ancient Egyptians survive a night in the desert? Through a combination of practical knowledge and systematic planning. They mapped water sources and followed routes that matched human endurance. They understood that temperature extremes could be managed through timing, clothing, and shelter. They recognized that psychological factors were as critical as physical ones, so they traveled in groups and maintained cultural practices that kept morale high. They weren't superhuman. They were intelligent, observant, and disciplined. But there's another answer, perhaps the more important one. They survived the desert night because they understood that the desert, for all its hostility, follows rules. Rules that could be learned, rules that could be taught. The ancient Egyptians looked at the Sahara, a landscape of chaos and death, and decided to study it rather than fear it. That decision, repeated across generations, transformed the desert from an impassable barrier into a navigable landscape. That's how empires are built. The ancient Egyptian mastery of desert survival shows us something crucial about human history. Progress isn't always driven by technology or invention. Sometimes it's driven by something simpler: attention. The willingness to pay attention to the world, to notice patterns others miss, to ask why, and then do the work to find the answer. The Sahara is still there. It's still as dangerous as it was 5,000 years ago, but somewhere in the accumulated knowledge of the ancient Egyptians, in their maps, their practices, their understanding, we see the foundation of how humans solve problems that seem insurmountable. But that raises another question entirely. If the ancient Egyptians mastered the desert so completely that some expeditions seemed almost ceremonial, what were they actually searching for in those remote reaches? What was worth the risk? What discoveries were they making out there in the sand, so far from the Nile? Some of those answers might surprise you. If you're curious about how ancient civilizations solved impossible problems through ingenuity and observation, subscribe for more documentaries that explore the untold stories of human achievement.